A scarred old donkey stood alone in the auction pen, while men leaned on the rails and laughed and called him worthless. Tessa Holloway counted the last coins in her palm and felt the cold weight of what handing them over would mean. No roof, no plan, no promise of tomorrow. She was 24 years old, 3 months an orphan, and down to her final dollar in a town that had already closed every door against her. Yet something in the animal's tired brown eyes held her where she stood. Something patient, something that seemed to know her before she knew herself. She did not yet understand that the ugly creature in front of her carried the secret of a mountain. She did not know he remembered a hidden cabin in the high blue country, where a good man had once lived and died alone. She did not know that her own father, dead and buried these long winter months, had passed through this same town years before and had given a stranger a kindness that was about to come full circle through the eyes of a beast nobody else wanted. All she knew in that moment was what the kindly widow at the boarding house had told her 3 days earlier, the words still ringing soft in her ears. Folks throw away what looks broken, child. But broken and worthless aren't the same word. Tessa drew a breath and bid her dollar. The town of Glenrock Junction sat at the foot of the Blue Mountains in eastern Oregon, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against a wind that came down off the high country with teeth in it. In the spring of 1886, Tessa Holloway arrived there carrying one carpet bag, a thin wool coat that had belonged to her mother, and the dwindling remainder of what her father had left behind when the fever took him the previous winter. $42 she had started with. $11 remained the morning the stage rolled into the dust of the main street and let her down beside the freight office. She stood there a long moment watching the stage roll away again and felt the weight of the country settle around her shoulders. She was 24 years old. She had her father's broad shoulders and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she could swing a hammer or drive a wedge or read the grain of an oak board the way other folks read scripture. Caleb Holloway had taught her all of that and more. He had been a wheelwright back in the valley south of the Cascades, a patient man with calloused hands and a soft voice, and the shop had been a place of warm light and the clean smell of fresh shaved wood. When the fever swept through that wet, hard winter and carried him off in 3 days, the debts he had quietly carried for years rose up and swallowed everything. The shop, the house, the tools she had grown up beside. The neighbors had been kind enough at the funeral and cool enough afterward. A young woman alone with no kin and no prospects was a kind of trouble nobody wanted to take in. So she had drifted. North first, then east, looking for any place that might have work for hands like hers. She had tried the dressmaker in the last town, and the boarding house, and the mercantile. None of them needed a girl with splinters in her palms and dirt under her nails. A young woman traveling alone made folks uneasy. A young woman traveling alone who could outwork most men twice her size made them downright suspicious. Each refusal trimmed another day off the time she had left before her coins ran out entirely. And now here she stood at the edge of the mountains with $11 to her name and no notion of where the night would find her. She made her way along the boardwalk, slowly reading the signs above the doors. A blacksmith, a gunsmith, a small stone church. A mercantile with the name Crail painted in faded red across the false front. A 2-story boarding house with white curtained windows and a porch swing creaking in the wind. The boarding house called itself Sparrows. She tried that first. The widow who answered the door was a thin, upright woman with iron gray hair, pinned tight, and eyes the color of river water. She studied Tessa for a long moment without speaking, and Tessa felt herself being weighed in a way she could not quite name. "How much for a room?" Tessa asked. $2 the night, $6 the week, meals included. Tessa swallowed. "Could I work some of it off mending, hauling anything that needs doing? I can fix near anything that's broken." The widow's mouth pulled at one corner, not quite a smile. "You could," she said, "most weeks. But I let my last room 2 days ago, and there isn't another bed in this house till the spring drover passes through and gives it up. What's your name, child?" "Tessa Holloway." Something moved behind the widow's eyes. A flicker. A small adjustment, like a person turning a page they had not expected to find. "Holloway," the widow said softly. "The name isn't a stranger to me, girl. I heard it once long years ago from a man who passed through this country and stopped at my table. He spoke of a wheelwright by that name down in the South Valleys. Said the wheelwright had done him a kindness when nobody else would." Tessa felt the breath catch behind her ribs. "That would have been my father," she said. "Caleb Holloway." The widow looked at her another long moment. The wind worried at the porch swing behind them, and somewhere down the street, a wagon creaked past. "I am sorry I do not have a room for you, Tessa Holloway," the widow said at last. "But I will tell you this for the sake of the name. Folks in this country throw away a great many things that only look broken. Don't you go and throw yourself away too. Broken and worthless are not the same word. You hear me?" Tessa nodded, not understanding, only feeling the weight of the words settle in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "I hear you, ma'am." The widow stepped back inside and closed the door. Tessa stood on the porch a long moment in the gray morning light, turning the strange exchange over in her mind. She did not know what to do with it. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that the door had closed and the wind was still cold and her coins were still few. She walked on. By the time she had tried the dressmaker and been told no, and the mercantile and been told no, and a small bakery whose proprietor had looked her up and down once and shaken his head before she even spoke, the morning was nearly gone. She came at last to a patch of trampled ground at the edge of town where a livestock auction was running, and she stopped to watch only because she had nowhere else to be. The auction yard smelled of dust and hay and animal sweat. Ranchers leaned against the rough plank rails, hats pulled low, calling out lazy bids for horses and mules. A bay gelding sold for $30. A pair of work mules went for $85 together. A young paint mare brought $42, which Tessa noted with a small bitter twist of recognition. Her whole inheritance in one animal gone in under a minute. She had no money for a horse. She had no land for one to graze. She watched only because watching cost nothing. Then they led out the donkey. He was old. That was the first thing. Gray around the muzzle and along the jaw, his coat shaggy and matted in patches, his head carried low. One ear was notched at the tip, a clean, half-moon bite, as if some other animal had taken a piece out of him long ago. A long, pale scar ran the length of his left flank, from withers to hip, the hair grown back white over the line of it. He limped on his off hind leg, just a small hitch, but enough that you could see it from the rail. He planted his hooves halfway into the ring and would not move. The handler pulled. The donkey did not budge. The handler pulled harder. The donkey turned his head and looked at the man with what could only be called weary contempt, and the men along the rails laughed. Glue factory wouldn't even take him. He kicked Pete McGlashan last Tuesday, broke a finger. 2 Bits says he's deaf-blind and witless. The auctioneer, a heavy man in a sweat-stained vest, mopped his face with a kerchief and waved a hand at the animal with a kind of disgusted theater. Gentlemen, here we have a fine specimen, a donkey of distinction, going cheap. Who'll start me at $1? Nobody spoke. The donkey lowered his head and stood like a stone. $1, the auctioneer called again. $1, practically free. Anybody. And then the donkey turned his head, slow, deliberate. He looked across the dust of the auction yard, past the laughing men, and his tired brown eyes settled on Tessa where she stood at the rail. And for reasons she would never quite be able to explain to herself for the rest of her life, she did not look away. There was something in that look, something patient, something that seemed to know her. $1, she heard her own voice say. The yard went quiet for one heartbeat. Then it broke open with laughter. A rancher in a long duster turned to her with his face creased in genuine amusement. 2 Bits says she don't know what end the trouble comes out of. You buying him for the soup pot, missy? Hold on to your money, child, before you do something you'll regret. Tessa felt the heat rise into her cheeks, but she kept her chin level the way her father had always taught her. Caleb Holloway had never raised his voice in his life and had never backed down from a thing he believed to be true, and his daughter had inherited both halves of that. $1, she said again, louder this time. Clear. The auctioneer stared at her a long moment. He looked at the donkey. He looked at her. He looked at the men along the rails, and Tessa could see him weighing whether to turn the bid into a joke at her expense or to take her money and be done with it. He brought his palm down hard against the top rail. "Sold to the young lady for $1. May the good Lord have mercy on her." The laughter rolled around the yard again, but Tessa was already moving. She walked to the gate of the pen, with every eye in the place fixed on her, and the handler grinned and held out a frayed lead rope, his teeth showing yellow under his mustache. "He's all yours, miss. Don't say nobody warned you." Tessa took the rope. She turned and walked the donkey out of the auction yard, and the men laughed at her back, and she did not turn around, and she did not let her chin drop, and she felt the rope rough and warm in her fist, and thought she might be sick. What had she done? She had spent $1 she did not have on an animal she did not need, could not feed, and had nowhere to keep. She had $10 left in the world, and now a mouth to feed besides her own. She did not even know what donkeys ate beyond a vague notion of grass and grain. "You are a foolish thing," she told the animal at the edge of the street. He flicked his notched ear and did not answer. She led him slowly down the main street of Glenrock Junction, and she felt the eyes from windows and porches following her. The widow at the boarding house, the mercantile clerk, the man at the freight office. None of them said anything. They only looked. She stopped at the livery stable at the south end of town and asked the price of boarding a donkey for a week. The liveryman quoted her a figure that made her stomach drop down toward her boots. A week of stabling would clean her out. She thanked him politely and walked on. She found a patch of green by the creek at the edge of town in the shadow of a stand of cottonwoods, and she let the donkey down to graze on the lead while she sat on a flat stone and put her face in her hands and tried very hard not to cry. She had $11. She had a donkey. She had no plan. A cold drizzle began to fall. She lifted her head after a time and watched the animal eat. He tore mouthfuls of green spring grass with steady patience, and as she watched him, she noticed the way he favored that off hind leg, and the way the scar puckered along his flank, where the hair grew back white. Somebody long ago had worked him hard. Somebody had pushed him through country that had cost him a leg and a piece of ear and a stripe of hide. And yet there was a settled calmness in the way he stood now, as if he had decided something she had not. The drizzle thickened. She drew her thin coat closer and felt the cold begin to find the bones of her. "I don't know where to go," she admitted out loud, surprising herself with how small her voice came out. The donkey lifted his head. He looked west, out past the cottonwoods, past the last weather-grayed roofs of Glenrock Junction, to where the great blue ridges of the mountains rose against a sky gone soft with rain. The peaks were lost in cloud. The lower slopes were dark with timber. Then he looked back at her. He took one step in that direction, testing the rope, and stopped, waiting. It was absurd. It was the most absurd thing in the world. Tessa Holloway, 24 years old, soaking wet, $10 to her name, sitting on a rock at the edge of a town that did not want her taking guidance from a donkey she had bought for $1. She thought of her father, of the steady, patient way he had read the grain of a board and known where the true line ran. He had told her once, working an oak plank under the lamp, that some things hide their best part underneath the ugly side, and a true craftsman is the one who can see through the surface to what waits below. She thought of the widow's words on the porch that morning. Broken and worthless are not the same word. She thought of how many doors had closed against her in how many towns. She rose to her feet. She gathered her carpet bag. She slung it across her shoulders and gave the rope a small shake. "All right," she said. "All right then, you lead. I will follow. Heaven knows I've made worse decisions today already."
The donkey did not hesitate. He turned full toward the mountains and began to walk, and his gait was steady despite the limp, and his head was set like a compass needle finding north.
They left the last buildings of Glenrock Junction behind in the gathering wet dusk. The road narrowed to a track within the first mile. The track narrowed to a trail within the second. The land climbed gently at first through stands of yellow pine and groves of trembling aspen, and the rain hissed soft in the new spring leaves. Tessa looked back once at the lamps beginning to glow in the windows of the town below, and at everything safe and known. And then she faced the dark green country rising ahead of her and followed the strange animal into it. The first night was the worst. The drizzle turned to a steady, bitter rain as the light went and the trail grew slick under her boots, and Tessa began to shiver in earnest as the cold worked its way through her thin coat. She had no shelter. She had no fire. She had nothing but the donkey and the dark, and a growing certainty that she was going to die on this mountain because she had been a soft-headed girl who could not say no to a sad-eyed animal at an auction. Then the donkey stopped. He stood beneath a wide rock overhang, a kind of natural lean-to, where the cliff face leaned out and made a roof of stone above a patch of dry earth. He planted himself broadside to the weather and would not be moved. He turned his head and looked at her and waited. She understood. She crawled in beside him out of the wind, and the dry ground under the rock was a mercy. She huddled against his warm flank, and his shaggy coat, ugly as it was, broke the worst of the cold from her bones. After a long while, her shivering eased. After a longer while, the deep, slow rumble of the animal's breathing began to steady her own. "You are not so foolish after all," she murmured into his fur. He sighed, a great rumbling breath, and some knot of loneliness she had been carrying since the day they put her father in the ground loosened a little. She decided then that he needed a name. "Obed," she said. From the book of Ruth, her mother had read to her on winter evenings. Obed, the name that meant servant, the name of the one who had come of a kindness shown to a stranger. The donkey's notched ear twitched. Obed it was. Morning came clear and cold. The rain had washed the world clean, and the high country opened in front of her in colors she had no language for. Greens she had never seen, stones the color of old bone, a sky so pale and bright it made her eyes water. Obed was already up when she woke, grazing on a tuft of bunch grass nearby, watching her with what she could only call patience. "Well," she said, working the stiffness out of her shoulders, "you got me through it. I suppose you have earned breakfast." She had half a heel of bread in her bag. She broke it and gave him a piece which he took from her palm with a surprising gentleness, lipping it up the way an old gentleman might accept a cup of tea. The other piece she ate slowly and washed it down with creek water cold enough to make her teeth ache. They climbed all that day. Tessa learned quickly that Obed knew this country in a way she did not. Where the trail forked, he chose without hesitation. Where the ground looked solid but hid a wet bog beneath the moss, he stopped flat and refused to step and snorted until she found a firmer line a few yards over. Once at a narrow ledge above a drop that made her belly turn over, he pressed her gently against the inside wall of the cut with the warm bulk of his body and would not let her pass on the outside edge. "You have been up here before," she realized aloud. "Haven't you? Somebody knew these trails, and you learned them too." The higher they climbed, the more the country amazed her. Tessa had grown up in the flat south valleys of the Willamette country, all wet green farmland and orchard rows, and she had never seen anything like the Blue Mountains. The way the ridges folded one behind another into hazy distance, the way the air smelled of pine pitch and cold stone and something faintly sweet she could not name, the way a hawk could hang motionless on the wind for whole minutes at a time, riding a current she could not see. By midday, her stomach had begun to complain, and her worry over food had begun to sharpen into something close to fear. But Obed led her into a sunlit clearing where wild strawberries grew thick and tiny along the edges of the meadow, and while she gathered them by the handful into her kerchief, he drank from a spring she would never have found on her own. The water was so cold and clean, it made her chest ache. "You are better at this than I am," she admitted, "and you are the one supposed to be the dumb animal." Obed flicked his tail as if to say he had never claimed any such thing. The trail steepened in the afternoon, switching back and forth across the face of a great timbered slope. Twice she had to stop and rest her legs, burning her breath coming hard. Obed plodded on without complaint. He only paused at the switchbacks to let her catch up his patient brown eye looking back down the trail, as if to ask whether she was still coming. She began to talk to him as they walked, the way a lonely person talks to anything that will listen, about her father, about the wheelwright shop, about the smell of fresh shaved oak and the satisfying tight fit of a well-turned spoke into a hub. About her mother dead these 8 years now, who had read to her by lamplight every winter night of her childhood. "He would have liked you," she told the donkey. "My father, I mean. He always said you could tell a creature's worth by whether it kept its word, and you have kept yours. You said you would lead me somewhere, and here we are, still climbing." Toward evening of that second day, they came to a high meadow ringed with old pines, and Obed stopped. He lowered his head and grazed, signaling plainly that here was where they would rest. She gathered deadfall for a small fire. She struck it with her father's flint and steel, one of the few things she had kept out of the wreckage of the shop. And she sat warming her hands as the stars came out one by one. More stars than she had ever seen in her life, spilled across the black sky like sugar across a tabletop, the great river of them running from horizon to horizon. "I do not know where you are taking me," she told Obed, "but I trust you." "That is a strange thing to say about a donkey I bought yesterday for $1. Yet here we are." She slept better that second night. In the small hours she woke once to find Obed stamping and snorting at the tree line, his ears pinned flat back against his skull. She held very still, her heart drumming in her throat. After a long moment, she heard something large move off through the brush. Something heavy. A bear, maybe. A cougar. She did not know. She only knew that Obed had driven it off, or warned it away, or held the line between her and it long enough for it to lose interest. "You are worth more than $1, she whispered when her pulse had quieted. "A great deal more." The third day they climbed higher. The trees grew shorter and more twisted. Sheer rock faces rose on either side of the trail, and in places the path was barely a scratch across the bare stone. And she clung to the worn pack saddle on Obed's back, a battered old leather rig she had found cinched beneath his matted coat at the auction yard. He picked his way across the bad places with the sure-footedness of a creature who had walked them 100 times. And still he climbed, certain as a compass needle, towards something only he could see. On the morning of the 4th day, they crossed a high pass between 2 stone peaks, and the world opened up below them. A green bowl, a sheltered hollow tucked into the folds of the mountain like a secret cupped in a giant hand. A stream tumbled down from the snowfields above and ran clear through the meadow at the bottom. Tall pines ringed the basin. Grass grew lush in the open center. And there, against the far slope, half hidden where the trees grew thick, stood a cabin. Tessa stopped on the pass and stared. The cabin was small and weathered to a soft silver gray. Its log walls were chinked with clay. Its roof of split shakes sagged in places but looked largely whole. A stone chimney rose from the gable end. Beside the cabin stood a sturdy lean-to with the posts still solid and the roof still tight, easily large enough to shelter an animal. A split-rail fence enclosed a small paddock gone to weeds. The whole place had the quiet, settled look of something built with care and then left empty for a long while. Obed's whole body changed. His head came up, his ears pricked sharp forward, and he loosed a long, ringing bray that echoed off the rocks of the surrounding peaks, came back doubled, came back tripled, came back from every wall of the basin at once. Then he started down. Not quite a run, not with that off hind leg of his, but eager, purposeful, the pace of a creature who has come home. "This is it," Tessa breathed. "This is where you were taking me." She hurried after him down the winding trail into the hollow. Obed went straight to the lean-to and stood beneath it, and then he turned his head and looked back at her, and his look was as plain as a spoken word. "Here. This is the place. This is where we belong." She walked up to the cabin door slow, as if approaching a sleeping thing. The door hung on heavy leather hinges and had swollen tight in its frame. She put her shoulder against it and pushed until it scraped open across the puncheon floor, and a long bar of pale spring light spilled into the dim interior. The cabin was the home of a careful man. One room, but well made. A rope-frame bed stood against the far wall, the ticking long since claimed by mice, but the frame still sound. A stone hearth occupied the chimney end, with iron hooks for kettles set into the rock, and a black cast-iron pot still hung on one of the hooks. A small table by the single window. 2 stools, shelves along the back wall holding tin plates, and a few dented cups, and a sack of something gone hard and dusty. And in the corner, neatly arranged, stood the tools. Tessa's breath caught. An axe with the head only lightly rusted, a bucksaw, a hammer, chisels in a row on a board, each with its handle worn smooth by use, a draw knife, a hand auger, a small block plane, a coil of stout rope, a whetstone, pack saddles and panniers and harness, all of them oiled once and hung from wooden pegs. Whoever had lived here had been a packer, a man who made his living hauling goods through high country no wagon could reach. And he had kept his equipment the way her father had kept his. Clean, sharp, ready for the next day's work. On the small table by the window, set square in the center, as though waiting, lay a leather-bound journal. She crossed to it slowly and lifted it. The cover was soft with damp. The pages crackled a little as she opened them. The handwriting was cramped and careful, and crowded the lines the hand of a man who had written by lamplight and meant for the words to last. She read the first entry standing in the bar of light from the door. "This is the journal of Ambrose Kettering, of this cabin, and of these mountains, begun this 20th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1875. I have been here 1 month and a day. Before I write of the country, or of the work, or of the partner I have lately bought to share the trails with me, I must write of something that came before. I am not a religious man, but I owe a debt that I mean to carry the rest of my days, and I mean to pay it forward as best a man can who has so little to pay it with. 3 winters past, I was a broken man. I had nothing in this world. I had walked a long road and lost what was mine to lose. And I had come at last to a wheelwright's shop in the South Valleys with no boots on my feet and no food in my belly and no expectation that any door would open to me. The wheelwright did not ask my name. He gave me a meal. He gave me a pair of his own boots. He said only that broken and worthless are not the same word, and that a man should remember that and pass it on when his time came. That kindness saved my life. I have not seen him since. I do not know if he yet lives, but I have promised myself, and I write it here so that I will not forget that I will spend the rest of my days passing on what he gave me. To any creature, 2-legged or 4, that the world has thrown away too quick. That is why I write here today. Tessa's hands had begun to shake. She did not yet understand all of what she was reading. The pieces were too large and too far apart, and her mind would not yet let them connect. But she felt the shape of something gathering around her in that small, dim cabin. Something old. Something patient. Something that had been waiting for her here in this hollow longer than she had been alive. She turned the page. The next entry began with the date and a single line. Bought a donkey today off a Mormon teamster who said the animal was no good. I have named him Obed. He has good eyes. Tessa stood a long time in the doorway. The light moved across the floor. Outside in the lean-to, the old donkey was already grazing the new grass that had grown up around the posts, his head down his tail switching at the spring flies perfectly at home. She walked out into the meadow then. She crossed to him slowly. She pressed her forehead against the warm gray fur of his neck, and his old hide smelled of sage and dust and sweat and sun, and he stood very still and let her. He loved you, she whispered. He took you in when nobody else would, and then you brought me here. Obed did not answer. He only breathed against her shoulder, slow and deep. After a long while, she straightened, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she went back into the cabin to take the measure of what was hers now, or what might be hers, if she had the strength to keep it. That evening she made a fire in the old hearth. The chimney drew. The stone warmed.
The cabin filled with light for the first time in who knew how long, and the smell of wood smoke rose into the rafters and seemed to settle something old at peace there.
She found a piped spring in the trees behind the cabin. The wooden trough still sounded the water running clear and cold and steady. She found a root cellar dug back into the slope dry and cool, with a few iron hooks still set into the beam where Ambrose Kettering must once have hung salt pork to cure. She found in a tin box on the highest shelf a small store of dried beans and cornmeal and salt, enough with care to last her a month if she was careful, and the wild country gave her anything at all. She slept that night under a roof for the first time in longer than she could remember, on a pallet she had laid out by the hearth, and Obed slept in his lean-to 30 paces off, and a great horned owl called once across the meadow, and was answered from the ridge above, and Tessa Holloway felt the loneliness of the past hard year lift off her shoulders a little. She did not yet know how much she had inherited. She did not yet know what waited for her down at the foot of the mountain in the dust of Glenrock Junction, where a hard-eyed man named Vance Whitaker had been watching the empty cabin in the high country for the better part of a year, and had already made his quiet move to take what nobody seemed to be claiming. She stayed 3 weeks. 3 weeks of mending and learning and finding her feet in the hollow. She patched the worst of the leaks in the cabin roof with new shakes split from a fallen pine, the fro in her hands feeling more natural with every cut. She re-chinked the gaps in the walls where the clay had crumbled. She cleaned the iron pot until it shone black again. She washed the rope frame of the bed and stuffed a fresh tick with dry meadow grass. She read more of the journal, a few pages each night by firelight. She read of the trails Ambrose had run, the Dutchman's claim along Granite Creek, where a German prospector named Eustace Pike worked a thin vein of gold, the Beckett brothers' diggings up the North Fork, Old Burrows, the trapper alone in his spruce pole cabin on the high meadows where the wolves still ran. She read of the prices Ambrose had charged, the favors he had done, the men who had trusted him with the only goods they could bring out of the mountains, and whose trust he had carried like a sacred thing for 11 long years. She read of his last winter, the cough that would not leave him, the weakness in his hands, the shame he had felt at being too sick to make the last trip to town, and his quiet decision when he knew the end was near to set the old donkey loose. He will find his way down, Ambrose had written. He knows the trails better than I ever did. Good animal. Best partner a man could ask for. If any soul should find this book, be kind to him. He has earned more than I can ever pay him. She read all of that, and she felt the weight of what she was inheriting settle into her hands. She did not yet know about the wheelwright. Ambrose had only written of him that once in the very first entry. The man's name was not given. Tessa read those words and thought of her father and felt the small shiver of a coincidence she could not quite shake, but she pushed it aside. The world was a wide country. A wheelwright had been kind once to a stranger. That was all. It was a good story. It was not the same story. She told herself that for 3 weeks. But the Blue Mountains do not give a life away for free, and on a clear morning in early summer, when her cornmeal had run low and her salt was nearly gone, and she had begun to think hard about a trip down the mountain for supplies, the country reminded her of that. She heard the hoofbeats first, not Obed. Obed was grazing in plain sight in the meadow below the cabin. These hoofbeats were heavier and faster, and they came up the trail from the south with the clean rhythm of an animal that had been pushed hard. Tessa stepped out of the cabin with her father's hammer in her hand. Not to threaten, only because it was the nearest thing to a weight, and a strange rider in this country was a thing to meet on your feet. The horse came up the trail and into the meadow. The man on its back drew rein at the edge of the grass and sat looking at her a long moment without speaking. He was lean and well dressed for the country. A long dark coat over a clean white shirt, a flat-crowned black hat low on his brow. His face was hard at the jaw and harder at the mouth, and his eyes, even at 30 paces, were the cold gray of slate that had never seen the sun. "You'd be the girl from the auction," he said. It was not a question. Tessa kept her chin level. "I would." "My name is Vance Whitaker. I run the freight outfit out of Glen Rock Junction." "The only one?" He let that settle. "I had heard a woman bought Kettering's donkey. I did not credit it. I rode up to see for myself." "You have seen then?" He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "You have made yourself comfortable here, Miss Holloway." She did not ask how he knew her name. He swung down from the saddle slowly, almost lazily, and let the reins drop. The horse stood. He walked a few paces into the meadow and turned and looked at the cabin and at the lean-to and at Obed standing patient in the sun and his mouth pulled at one corner. "This cabin," he said, "and the ground it stands on, and the ground for 200 yards in every direction, was claimed 11 months ago. The claim was filed in good order at the county seat in Baker City. The claim was filed by me." The breath went out of her slowly. "Ambrose Kettering lived here," she said. 11 years. "Ambrose Kettering was a squatter. He filed no patent. He paid no fee. He died without an heir and without a will, and the ground reverted to the public domain. And when it did, I took it. Legally, cleanly, with proper paper." She felt the cold rise up the back of her neck. "I have 90 days then," she said. Quiet, not asking, making him say it. He tilted his head slightly, almost approving. "You have 90 days from the date of filing to contest. The date of filing was the 7th of August last. You have until the 7th of November to bring forth a competing patent, a will, or any document of conveyance that would set my claim aside. After that, the ground is mine, and you are a trespasser, and I will have the marshal up here to remove you and that ugly animal from my property." He let it hang in the warm summer air between them. Then he touched the brim of his hat, almost polite, almost kind. The way a man tips his hat to a woman he is putting out of her home. "I have no quarrel with you personally, Miss Holloway. I am told you are a hard-working girl who has come on bad times. If you choose to leave quietly before the date, I will see you have a fair stake to start again somewhere else. $100 cash the day you ride out. That is a generous offer in this country. I would advise you to take it." He swung back into his saddle. He gathered his reins. "You have 90 days, he said. Or more honestly, you have 83. I am told you are stubborn. I am told your father was the same. Stubbornness is a fine quality in its place, but it does not stand up well against the law." He turned the horse. He rode back down the trail the way he had come, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded into the timber, and Tessa Holloway stood in the meadow of the hollow that was no longer surely hers, with her father's hammer in her hand, and the slow, terrible understanding spreading through her that the fight for this place had begun before she ever knew there was a place to fight for. She stood a long time. Obed walked up across the meadow without being called, and stood at her shoulder and lowered his gray head and pressed it once gently against her side. 83 days, she whispered. The wind moved through the high pines above the hollow. The shadows of the clouds ran across the grass. She thought of the $11 she had arrived with, of which only 3 remained. She thought of the $1 she had spent on a worthless donkey. She thought of the journal on the table in the cabin of the wheelwright in the South Valleys, whose name Ambrose had not written of the widow on the porch, who had said the Holloway name was not a stranger to her, of all the threads that ran through this country, like the unseen veins in a slab of oak. She thought of her father. She thought of what he would have done. She drew a long breath. She lifted her chin. She turned and walked back toward the cabin with Obed plodding patient at her side, and she set her father's hammer down on the table beside the leather-bound journal of Ambrose Kettering, and she began in the small, dim quiet of the cabin in the hollow to plan how she would fight. She made her plan that very night by the light of the hearth, with the journal of Ambrose Kettering open beside her on the small table, and a stub of pencil and a scrap of brown paper she had found tucked into the back of the book. She would not run. That much was settled the moment Vance Whitaker had finished speaking and ridden out of the meadow. She would not take his $100 and start over somewhere else, and become by her own quiet surrender the next woman the town of Glen Rock Junction would forget by the first hard frost. She was 24 years old. She had her father's shoulders and her mother's jaw, and she had been given a cabin and a partner and a small green hollow at the top of the world, and she meant to hold it. But holding it would take more than stubbornness. It would take money she did not have. It would take respect from a country that had laughed her out of a livery stable barely a month before. And it would take a competing claim or a will or some piece of paper that did not yet exist as far as she could find. She had 83 days. She read the journal again more carefully this time, looking for anything that might serve as a record of ownership. Ambrose Kettering had been a thorough man in many things, but the paper of his life was thin. He had recorded prices and trips and weather and the names of the men he served. He had not anywhere she could find written out a deed to the ground his cabin stood on. The country up here had been free in the way the country had once been free everywhere, and a man who built a cabin and dug a spring and ran a paddock had simply built and dug and run. And that had been enough until a man like Vance Whitaker had decided to bring the law up the mountain with him. She closed the journal at last and looked across the firelight at the tools on the wall. She could not make a deed appear out of thin air, but she could do the work. She could do the work Ambrose had done on the routes Ambrose had run for the men Ambrose had served. She could put herself before this country and let it choose week by week whether to remember the packer it had loved or to give itself over to the freight outfit it had not. She would offer herself to the high camps directly. No middleman, no permission from Glenrock Junction. She would carry up what they needed and bring down what they had, and she would let her name spread the only way a name spreads in country like this, by the work itself. She loaded Obed before dawn. What stock she had to offer was small. A few of Ambrose's surplus tools she could spare and would not need. A batch of pitch pine kindling she had split fine and bundled with twine. A bag of the dried beans from the high shelf of the cabin. A jar of wild strawberry preserves she had put up the week before from the meadow berries sweetened with the very last of her sugar. It was not much. It was a beginning. She studied the journal one last time at the table with the light just gray in the east, and traced with her finger the route Ambrose had marked toward Granite Creek, and the diggings of the German prospector named Eustace Pike. 2 days up, 2 days back. Country. She had never walked on a trail she had never seen with an animal who had walked it 100 times before her. "All right, old man," she said to Obed in the lean-to as she cinched the load tight. "You taught me the way home. Now teach me the way to work." He flicked his notched ear and gave a soft, patient snort, ready when she was. They climbed out of the hollow into the cool of morning. The country north of the cabin was higher and harder than what she had crossed coming in. The trail wound up through stands of subalpine fir, then broke out onto open shoulders of bare rock, where the wind blew steady and the marmots whistled from the boulder fields. Obed knew it all. Where the trail seemed to disappear into broken scree, he found the goat track that ran along the lip of it. Where a snow-melt creek crossed the path in a churning rush of white water, he stopped at the right ford and would not be hurried until Tessa had unloaded the pannier and led him through and reloaded on the far side. He had carried Ambrose Kettering across this same creek how many times? 200, 500. The donkey did not count. He only remembered. They camped that night above the timberline in a high cirque under a sky so close it felt like she could reach up and put her hand among the stars. The next morning, they dropped down the far side of the divide into the headwaters of Granite Creek. She heard Eustace Pike before she saw him. The hard, rhythmic clink of a pick against rock ringing up out of the timber below her. The sound of a man who had been swinging a tool at the same stone for so long that the rhythm had become his pulse. She came down the trail with Obed plodding behind, and the trees broke open into a small clearing where a creek tumbled white over boulders, and a man in a battered brown felt hat stood waist deep in a cut he had dug into the hillside, the pick rising and falling in his hands. He saw her. The pick stopped. He climbed slow out of the cut and stood at its edge, a short, broad man with a beard, gone gray at the chin, and pale blue eyes set deep in a face brown as old leather. And he did not say a word. He looked at her. He looked at Obed. He looked again at Obed longer, and something in his face shifted that had not been there before. "That is Kettering's animal," he said. His voice carried the soft burr of the German country he had come from a long time ago, but the words were plain American. "I would know that ugly face anywhere." "It is," Tessa said. "He brought me home." The man came down out of the cut and walked across the clearing toward her slow and careful, and he stopped a few paces off and studied her with those pale blue eyes. "You are who, then?" "Tessa Holloway. I live in Ambrose Kettering's cabin now. I have taken up his trade. I have come to ask if you still need a packer." He was quiet a long moment. "Kettering is dead," he said. Not a question. He had known for some time. "He is. He left his journal. He left the cabin. He left this donkey by way of an auction yard down in the junction. I have read the journal. I know what he carried for you and what he carried back." Eustace Pike looked at the load on Obed's back. He looked at the strawberry preserves she had set on top of the kindling bundle, the glass catching the morning light. "How much for the jar of preserves?" It was her first sale. He paid her $1 for the jar and another $2 for the bundle of kindling, which was twice what kindling was worth in any town she had ever been in, but which up here, where every stick of dry wood had been carried in on someone's back or chopped with frozen hands in midwinter, was a fair and even price. He paid her in heavy silver coins she could feel the weight of in her palm. He told her in his careful, soft voice that he had a sack of small ore samples he wanted carried down to the assayer in Baker City the next time she went that way, and that he would pay her a fair share of whatever the rock proved out at. He told her one more thing before she went. "Kettering was a good man," he said. "He was the only man in this country I trusted with my back to him. If you have his cabin and his donkey and his book, then maybe you are something of what he was. We will see." He held out his hand. She shook it. His palm was hard as the stone he dug. "We will see," she agreed. She rode out of Granite Creek with $3 silver in her pocket and a promise of more, and she felt something open inside her chest that had been closed since the day they had put her father in the ground. She found the Beckett brothers next. Wyatt and Tate Beckett were two lean, weathered men in their middle 30s who worked a placer claim on the North Fork 3 days east of the Pike diggings. And they had been doing without a packer since Ambrose had stopped coming the autumn before. They lived in a low cabin built half into a hillside with smoke curling out of a sheet iron chimney. And they came out of it together when Obed brayed in the yard, and the two of them stood shoulder to shoulder and stared at the donkey for a long moment without speaking. Wyatt was the older. He had a thin, pale scar that ran through one eyebrow and made the eyebrow grow white above it. "Where did you come by Kettering's mule?" "He is a donkey," Tessa said, "and I bought him at the auction in Glenrock Junction for $1. Tate the younger laughed once, not unkind, just startled. $1. $1. Lord have mercy." She told them what she had to offer and what she could carry. She told them about Eustace Pike. She told them she would come up every 2 weeks if they would have her, and that she would carry their dust down to Mercer Crail at the Mercantile and bring back whatever they needed and split the freight fare. The Beckett brothers listened without speaking, and at the end of it, Wyatt scratched at his jaw a long moment and then nodded once slow. "All right, then. Let us see what you can do." She got the same answer 2 days later, and 1 ridge over from Old Burrows the trapper. He was a tall, white-bearded man who lived alone in a cabin so deep in the spruce that the sun did not reach the door before mid-morning, and he came out with a long-barreled rifle in the crook of his arm. When Obed brayed in his yard, and he stood looking at her for a full minute before he said anything at all. "Kettering," he said finally. "Where?" "He is gone." The old man nodded once, slow, as though he had known and only now allowed himself the knowing. "Come in, then. I have coffee. The young woman who brings his donkey up the trail is welcome to my table." She drank coffee with him in the dim cabin while the wood stove ticked, and she made her offer. And Old Burrows, who had not spoken 3 sentences in 3 months, told her quietly that he had a stack of marten and fisher pelts in his loft that he had been waiting to send down with somebody he trusted, and that she would do. She rode out of his yard with a list of small kindnesses she had not expected. A jar of bear grease he gave her for Obed's tack. A small knife with a bone handle he pressed into her hand at the door, saying only that a woman alone in this country ought to have one within reach. A scrap of paper on which he had drawn in a careful old man's hand a map of 3 high meadows where the wild iris bloomed thickest in June, in case she ever wanted to see something that was worth seeing. By the end of her 2nd week on the trails, she had 4 customers in the high country. By the end of the 4th week, she had 6. Word traveled in the high country the way water travels downhill. Slowly, but it always gets where it is going. Eustace Pike told the Beckett brothers about her. The Beckett brothers told a pair of prospectors over on Cedar Ridge. Cedar Ridge mentioned her to a coal finder up in the East Fork country. Old Burrows, who did not speak to anyone if he could help it, somehow let it be known among the trappers of the high meadows that the girl who had Kettering's donkey was a girl whose word was good and whose pack would arrive when she said it would. Within 2 months, Tessa Holloway had become a known quantity in the Blue Mountains. The young woman with the scarred donkey. Who would carry your goods up the worst trails in the territory? Who never failed to come when she said she would? Whose ugly old animal could find a safe path through fog so thick you could not see your own boots? She was reliable. That was the thing the men came to prize above all. She prospered. Not richly, never richly, but enough. Enough to keep the cabin stocked with flour and beans and salt pork. Enough to mend her clothes and put a small store of silver into a tin under a loose floorboard against the day she would have to pay a lawyer. Enough she let herself think one bright, clear morning at the end of July to perhaps even fight Vance Whitaker on his own ground. The country tested her, of course. Country like this always tests. She was a week out from a long run to Old Burrows' place with Obed, loaded heavy with winter goods. The trapper had asked her to bring up early when she slipped on a patch of loose shale, crossing a high saddle, and went down hard. The pain in her ankle was so bright and so immediate that for a long moment she could not see. She sat on the scree with her hands flat on the stone and her breath coming in shallow gasps, and she felt the first true terror of her solitude. No one knew where she was. No one would come looking. If she could not walk, she would not eat. It was that simple and that close. Obed walked to her slow across the loose stone. He nosed her shoulder once. He stood close. He went very still, and then he lowered himself a little at the knees, the way an old animal lowers itself for a load it knows how to carry, and Tessa understood. She gripped the worn pack saddle. She hauled herself up against his patient bulk. She set her weight against him. He bore her home, step by halting step. 12 miles of trail in fading light. Stopping whenever she gasped. Waiting whenever she had to rest her forehead against his warm neck and breathe through the white pain in her ankle. By the time they came down into the hollow, it was full dark, and a small cold rain had begun to fall, and Tessa Holloway was weeping, not from the pain, from the gratitude, from the overwhelming, simple, unanswerable fact that this old, ugly, scarred animal had saved her life as surely as she had once saved his. She wrapped the ankle tight. She stayed off it the better part of a week. Obed grazed close to the cabin the whole time, as if he understood she needed watching. And at night, he stood near enough to the door that she could see his pale shape in the moonlight when she woke. It was during those days with her ankle propped on a stool by the hearth that she read the journal more carefully than she had read it before. She had been moving too fast to read it before. She had been climbing and selling and learning trails. Now she sat. Now she had nothing to do but turn pages, and she turned them slow. She read of the second autumn Ambrose had spent in the cabin the year after he had bought the donkey from the Mormon teamster. Of a hard October. Of a hunt for late firewood up on a north slope where the timber lay heavy on the ground, and the bears had been thick that fall fattening for the winter sleep. She read this. The first day of October. I had gone up the slope above the lower meadow to drag down a deadfall pine I had been eyeing all summer for stove wood. I had Obed with me to skid the logs. I took my eye off the country, which is the one thing in this country a man must never do, and I did not see the sow grizzly until she was 20 paces off and coming hard. I had only the small belt axe. The rifle was leaned against the cabin wall a half-mile below. I would be dead now, if not for the donkey. He came between us. He put himself between me and the bear with a speed I would not have thought possible from him. The sow went for his flank. He took the swipe across his offside from his withers to his hip. He kicked her in the jaw with his off hind hoof. At the same moment, a clean, hard blow, and the sow turned aside and went off into the timber bellowing, and the donkey stood his ground until she was gone. Then he stood while I dressed the wound. I had to lead him down to the cabin with my coat held against his flank to staunch the bleeding. The cut ran the whole length of his side. I cleaned it with the spring water and packed it with pine pitch and a torn shirt, and he did not flinch. He did not pull away. He let me work. The wound healed slow and ugly. The hair grew back white over the line of it. It is a long, pale stripe down his off flank and a notch in his off ear where the sow caught him last, and these marks I will read for the rest of my life as the writing on a creature who took a bear for me and did not even pause to think on it. He is the best partner a man could ask for. I write that here because I will not always remember to say it aloud, and he will not always be alive to hear me say it. And it ought to be set down where it cannot be lost. Tessa lowered the book slowly into her lap. She turned her head and looked out the open door of the cabin into the meadow where Obed stood grazing in the late summer light, his shaggy gray hide patched with the long pale stripe she had read all wrong from the very first moment she had laid eyes on him. She had thought somebody beat him. She had thought somebody had worked him too hard and left the mark of it across his side. She had thought the notched ear and the scar and the tired brown eyes had been the marks of a creature the world had broken. They were not. They were the marks of a creature who had stepped between his man and a bear. She set the journal down on the stool beside her and got up onto the bad ankle and limped slow across the cabin floor and out into the meadow. And she crossed to him through the long grass, and she put both her hands on his warm gray neck, and she pressed her forehead against him, and she could not for a long while speak. "You took a bear for him," she finally said. "You took a bear. Obed turned his head and breathed once slow against the side of her face. The wind moved across the meadow. She stood with him a long time. She rode down the mountain a week later with her ankle still tender, but holding to make her run to Mercer Crale's mercantile and to spend a few of her hard silver dollars on the things she could not get in the high country. Salt, lamp oil, a small sack of green coffee beans, a spool of strong waxed thread. She tied Obed at the rail outside the mercantile and went in to find Mercer Crale standing behind the counter with a face that did not match the warm hello he gave her. He looked at the door of the store. He looked at the window. He came around the counter and walked to the front and pulled the green window shade down halfway, the way a man does who does not wish to be seen by someone passing in the street. And then he turned to her and spoke low. "Miss Holloway, I will speak plain because I do not have much time, and I will not say this twice, and I will deny I ever said it if you put me to the question. Do you understand me?" Tessa felt the cold rise. "I understand. There is a man named Cole Renner who works for Whitaker. He came in here 3 nights ago to buy lamp oil and tobacco. He drank a little before he came in. He was talking. He said things in front of me he should not have said." He stopped. He looked at the window again. He went on. "Eustace Pike has been told that the freight outfit will carry his ore samples down to Baker City for half the rate you charge. The Beckett brothers have been offered the same. The man over on Cedar Ridge has been offered better. Whitaker is going to every customer on Kettering's old routes one by one, and he is cutting the price to a place where no living person can match it. He means to bleed you out before your 90 days are up. He means for you to be broke before you ever see a judge." Tessa's hands closed slowly on the edge of the counter. "They will turn me away. Some will not. Pike will not, I do not think. Burroughs will not. The Becketts I cannot say. But you will lose customers, Miss Holloway, and worse than that." "Worse?" Mercer Crale looked at her a long, steady moment, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept well. "You keep a cache, do you not, down at the foot of the mountain, where the trail comes off the divide? A small storage shed you have been using to lay in goods for the high country and to leave goods coming down." "I do." "You ought not to keep it there much longer." She felt the breath leave her. "He would not," she said. "He would not dare." "He would dare a great deal," Mercer Crale said. "I have known Vance Whitaker for 11 years. He would dare more than you would believe of a Christian man. I am telling you this for the sake of my own soul, Miss Holloway, because I have stood by too many years and watched him take what he wanted, and I am tired of it. But I will not testify. I am a coward at the bottom of myself. I am sorry. Do what you must." He turned away from her then and walked back behind the counter and busied himself with a sheaf of receipts he did not need to busy himself with. And Tessa understood that the conversation was over. She rode back up to her cache that very afternoon. She rode fast. She rode hard. Obed knew the urgency of it and did not complain. She made it to the shed in the last gray light of evening. The smoke was already rising over the trees. She crested the rise above the small cache shed she had built into the cottonwoods at the foot of the mountain trail, and she saw the orange glow of it and the smoke pouring up black against the last of the sunset. And she came down off Obed at a half run and stumbled toward the fire, knowing already that she was too late. The shed was a square of flame. Inside it, all but burning, was the better part of her summer's earnings. 3 weeks of flour she had brought up from the junction, a barrel of lamp oil, the new wool blankets she had laid in for winter trade, 100 pounds of beans, the good axe head she had bought herself in July, the new pack saddle she had ordered from the saddler in Baker City and had been paying off in installments, the spare tack, the folded canvas tarps, everything. She stood 30 paces back from the heat of it, with her hands closed into fists at her sides, and she watched it burn, and there was no water close enough, and no way to fight it now, and she could only watch. Obed stood behind her, very still. The roof caved in with a soft sigh of sparks. The walls fell inward. The fire ate what was left of her summer with a patient, hungry sound, and she stood and watched it until the last beam fell and the heat began to fade and the dark came down and the orange embers lay in a heap where her livelihood had been. She did not weep. She could not. Something in her had gone past the place where weeping comes from. She walked back to Obed in the dark. She put her hand on his neck. She stood there a long minute. "He has done it," she said. The old donkey breathed against her. "I cannot prove it. There will be no boot prints. There will be no man seen on the trail. Mercer Crail will not testify. He will not even admit he told me to expect it." She drew a long breath. "But I know." She climbed back up to the cabin that night, slow and tired, and burned out hollow inside, and she did not light the fire when she got there. She sat in the dark at the small table with the journal of Ambrose Kettering open in front of her. She could not read it. She only sat with her hand flat on the cover of it. The wind moved in the pines outside. The old donkey settled in his lean-to, and after a long while, she put her head down on her arms on the table and slept where she sat. She woke in the gray dawn with her face stiff from the leather of the journal cover, and a thing decided itself in her without her having to decide it. She would go and ask Eulalie Sparrow. Whatever the widow had been holding back the morning Tessa had come up to her porch with her carpet bag, whatever the strange flicker had been behind those river water eyes when Tessa had given her name, it was time. The journal had a wheelwright in it, whose name Ambrose had not written. The widow had a story about a wheelwright in the South Valleys she had heard from a man who had stopped at her table. Tessa had been pushing those two threads apart for months. It was time to put them in her two hands together and see what was made. She rode down the mountain. She left Obed at the livery at the south end of town. She walked up the boardwalk to Sparrow's boarding house, and she climbed the 3 steps to the porch, and she stood a moment looking at the front door before she lifted her hand and knocked. The widow answered. She wore an apron over a gray dress. She had flour on her hands. She looked at Tessa a long moment, and Tessa could see in her face that the woman had been expecting her perhaps for weeks. "Come inside, child," the widow said. "I have been waiting for you to come and ask. Come in." She led Tessa back through the dim hallway past the parlor with its lace-curtained windows into a small, clean kitchen at the back of the house where bread was rising under a cloth on the table and a kettle ticked on the iron stove. The widow wiped her hands on her apron and pulled out a chair and motioned Tessa into it. She poured 2 cups of strong black coffee from a blue speckled pot and set one in front of Tessa and sat down across from her. "You have come about the wheelwright," she said. "Yes." The widow took a slow sip of her coffee. She set the cup down. She folded her hands on the table. "I will tell you," she said, "and I will tell you straight, because you have earned the straight telling. But you will need to hold on to the table while I do, child, because some of this is going to land hard." Tessa put her hands flat on the wood. "Go on." 8 years ago, the widow said, a man came up the steps of this house in the late spring. He was barefoot. He had no hat. He had no coat. His clothes were rags. He had a sickness on him I have seen before in men who have not eaten in a week, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has decided the road is going to kill him and has stopped fighting that conclusion. I had a room. I gave it to him. I fed him soup. I asked no questions. He stayed 3 days. On the 2nd day, he began to speak a little. On the 3rd day, he told me his story. He had been a packer once far south. He had lost everything he had to a partner who had cheated him. He had walked north from California with no plan and no destination. He had come through the South Valleys hungry and sick, and he had stopped at a wheelwright shop because the shop door was open and he could smell food cooking somewhere inside it. The widow paused. She drew a slow breath. She went on. The wheelwright had a young daughter then, about 16. The man told me the girl had been the one who first saw him at the door. She had called her father from the back of the shop, and the wheelwright had come and looked at the broken man on his step, and had not asked his name, and had not asked his trouble. He had only brought him inside. He had set him at his own family's table. His wife had been alive then, and she had set out a bowl of stew. And when the man had eaten and warmed and slept a little by the fire, the wheelwright had brought out his own second-best pair of boots and pressed them into the man's hands and said only that broken and worthless, were not the same word, and that a man should remember that and pass it along when his time came. Tessa could not feel her hands. "What was the wheelwright's name?" she whispered. The widow looked at her steady. "You know the name, child." "Say it." "Caleb Holloway. The wheelwright was your father. The girl at the door was you. The barefoot man who came up the steps of this boarding house 3 years later and ate at my table and told me the story of how he had been saved was Ambrose Kettering. He had stopped here on his way up into the Blue Mountains. He had come up here to start his life over. He told me the wheelwright's name because he wanted me to know it in case someday, somehow, the name should ever come walking up onto my own porch in trouble. He said, "Forgive me. Let me speak the words right." The widow closed her eyes. She opened them. He said, "Should ever a Holloway come to your door in need, Mrs. Sparrow, you will know that the wheel has come round. You will know that a debt the size of a life is in front of you. You will see that the debt is paid as best you can pay it. Will you do that for me, ma'am? I am going up into a country where I do not know if I will ever come down again, and I do not know if I will live long enough to pay this debt myself. I am laying it in your keeping." The widow opened her eyes again. "I told him I would." She drew a long, slow breath. "And then you came up onto my porch, child, with your father's name on your tongue, with nothing in your hand but a thin coat and a carpet bag and the last of your money. And I had let my last room 2 days before, and I could not give you a bed, and I have not slept a full night since for the shame of it. I tried to tell you the only thing I could think to tell you, the thing he had told me, about broken and worthless not being the same word. I thought you might at least carry the saying with you, even if I could not carry you." She looked across the table at Tessa. "I did not know then that you had already bought his donkey. I did not know then that the donkey would carry you up the mountain to his cabin. I did not know then that the wheel had already come round in a way far stranger and far larger than anything I could have arranged." She put her hand across the table and laid it over Tessa's hand. "But it has," she said. "It has come round. You are not alone in that hollow, child. There are 2 men standing behind you in that cabin, and one of them is your father, and the other is a man your father saved, and they will not let go of you now." Tessa Holloway sat at the widow's kitchen table for a long time without speaking. She felt very still. She felt very full. She felt the slow, terrible, beautiful thing of understanding what her life had been doing without her knowledge, of seeing finally the shape of the work that had been done on her behalf in years she could not remember, and by hands she could not see. Her father's quiet kindness on a spring afternoon when she was 16. a pair of his second best boots pressed into the hands of a stranger who had carried that kindness up into a mountain hollow and lived 11 years on it and bought an ugly donkey nobody else wanted and trained the donkey and trusted the donkey, and when his time came, had set the donkey loose with a final blessing and the certain knowledge that the animal knew the trails better than any man living. The donkey had come down off the mountain. The donkey had stood in an auction pen and looked across the dust at the daughter of the wheelwright who had once fed his master. The wheel had come round. She drew a long breath. She lifted her head. "The cash burned last night," she said. "Whitaker's man. I cannot prove it. He has cut my prices with my customers. He means to break me before my 90 days are out." The widow's eyes hardened. "Then we will not let him." I am old," the widow said. "I am a coward in some things. I will not lie to you, but I have a name in this town, child. I have known Vance Whitaker since he was a boy, and I know what he was then, and I know what he has become, and I have kept my mouth shut for too many years. The wheel has come round for me too. You go back up your mountain. You hold what is yours. You bring me word when you need word brought, and I will speak when the time comes for speaking. I owe a man a promise. I mean to keep it." Tessa stood up slowly. Her legs were not steady. "Mrs. Sparrow, Eulalie, we are past the misuses now, child." "Eulalie, thank you." "Do not thank me. Go and do the work." Tessa walked out of the boarding house into the late afternoon light of Glenrock Junction, and the town looked exactly as it had looked the morning she had arrived in the spring, and nothing about it was the same. She walked down the boardwalk. She walked past the mercantile, and past the church, and past the freight office of Vance Whitaker, with its black painted sign, and she did not look in the window of it. She walked to the livery, and she paid the boy at the door her 2 bits, and she led Obed out into the dust of the street. She stood at his shoulder a long moment. She put her hand against his warm gray neck. "He fed your master," she said quietly, "and your master gave you to me, and I will not lose this. Do you understand? I will not lose this for him. I will not lose this for you. I will not lose this for any of us." The old donkey breathed against her hand. The sun was beginning to slope toward the west, and the long blue ridges of the high country stood up clean against the sky, and the trail up into them lay open and waiting. Tessa Holloway took the lead rope in her hand and turned the old donkey toward the mountain, and they walked out of Glenrock Junction together into the long light of the evening, and somewhere behind them, in a small kitchen at the back of a boarding house, an old widow stood at her stove with both hands flat on the iron and bowed her head and kept a promise she had made 8 years before to a barefoot stranger. Autumn came hard and early to the Blue Mountains that year. The aspens turned in the second week of September, 2 weeks ahead of any year Tessa had heard tell of. The wind off the high passes carried the smell of snow by the third week. The marmots whistled down into their stone-roofed dens and did not come up again. Old Burrows, on her last run to his cabin in the spruce, looked at the sky a long time and then looked at her and said only, "It is coming early, child. Lay your wood in deep." And she had nodded, and she had said she would, and she had ridden back down the trail with the cold already creeping up under the collar of her coat. In a way, it should not have been creeping in the middle of September. She had 31 days left. The 90 days Vance Whitaker had given her on the meadow in front of the cabin had bled themselves down to 31, and she had nothing yet to set against him. No deed, no will, no paper. She had a journal full of a dead man's penciled notes and a widow in town who had said she would speak when the time came, and a handful of high country men who knew her name and would swear to her work. But no court in Baker City was going to set aside a properly filed patent claim on the testimony of 3 prospectors and a trapper. She knew that. She had spent 2 evenings by the fire reading the back pages of the journal one more time, hunting for any line, any reference, any clue that Ambrose Kettering had left a paper somewhere she had not yet looked. She had found nothing. She had her cabin. She had her partner. She had her name in the high country. And in 31 days, she was going to lose all of it, and Vance Whitaker was going to walk up the trail with a marshal beside him and put her off the only piece of ground that had ever felt to her like home. She did not let herself think about it for long stretches. She worked. She laid in firewood. She mended the chinking around the cabin's north wall, where the autumn wind had begun to find new gaps. She put up the last of the wild strawberry preserves. She walked the small paddock and mended 2 rails that had rotted at the joins. She did the work that the cabin would need done, whether she was the one living in it through the winter or whether some other soul was. She told herself as she worked that the work itself was its own answer, that whether she kept the cabin or lost it, the cabin would be the better for her having loved it. She almost believed it, almost. The snow came on the 9th day of October. It came down like a country had given up on holding it back. It came down in a high wind out of the northwest in flakes the size of silver dollars. And within an hour, the meadow in front of the cabin was white. And within 2 hours, the trail down the mountain was buried. And within 4 hours, Tessa Holloway was standing at the cabin door, looking out at a world gone strange and silent and white, with the air so thick she could not see the lean-to from the doorway, and the only sound the soft hiss of snow against the shake roof. It was too early. It was much too early. October 9th, and a storm like this had no business being on the mountain for another 6 weeks. She made up the fire high. She brought in 3 armloads of split wood from the porch. She filled the iron kettle and set it on the hook. She went out into the wind one more time to make sure Obed was inside the lean-to with the heavy canvas tarp she had hung across the open side as a windbreak, and she gave him a double measure of the oats she had brought up from the junction at the last run, and she stood with her hand on his neck a long moment in the soft, warm dark of the lean-to, and felt his low, steady breath against her rib.
"Stay close, old man."
His ear flicked once. She went back inside the cabin and barred the door against the wind, and she sat by the hearth with the journal of Ambrose Kettering open on her knees, and she watched the firelight move across the page. She could not read for thinking, and she listened to the wind, and she waited. The pounding on the door came 2 hours after full dark. She had been half asleep in the chair the journal slipped down into her lap when the sound jolted her awake. A fist on the heavy door. Not knocking, striking. The blows of a man who could not feel his own hands and was using the last of himself to be heard. She crossed the cabin in 3 steps and through the bar. The door blew inward on the wind. Snow came in with it in a white roar, and with the snow came 2 men half stumbling, half falling into the warmth of the cabin. They were Wyatt and Tate Beckett. Their beards were caked white. Their coats were stiff with ice. Wyatt was holding his brother up under the arm, and Tate's eyes were the unfocused eyes of a man who had been walking through a storm so long he had stopped feeling cold and started feeling warm, which was the worst place a man on a mountain could come to.
"Get him by the fire,"
Tessa said. She was already moving. She got Tate down onto the pallet by the hearth. She stripped his frozen coat off him and wrapped him in 2 of the wool blankets from the bed. She set the kettle close to the flames, and she put coffee grounds and a pinch of salt into the pot. And she did not ask anything yet. She had been around enough hard country to know that a man brought in from a storm needs his body warm before his mouth will work right. Wyatt sat on the second stool with his hands shaking around the tin cup she pushed into them. He drank. He drew a breath. He looked at her with eyes that were red and old. "Jonas," he said. That was all. He said it once. He did not say it again. He did not need to. "When?" Tessa said. "This morning. He left the diggings at first light with a string of 3 pack mules and 40 pounds of fall or samples. He was going down to Mercer Crail at the Mercantile. He had been going to make the run with us this time. We were going to come with him. We did not. There was a vein we had hit at the cut 3 days ago, and Tate would not leave it, and I would not leave Tate, and we let the boy ride alone. We let him ride alone, Miss Holloway." His voice broke. He was supposed to come down by the South Fork Trail. He knows that trail. He has walked it 20 times. He should have been safe to Crails by mid-afternoon. The storm did not start where we were until near 3. He should have been in town long before. And he was not. He was not. There was a man working through the storm to come up the freight road tonight from the junction. A teamster who had been laying over with us at our cabin 3 nights for a load. He started down at noon ahead of the storm. He came back at dusk. He had passed Whitaker's outfit 2 hours down. He stopped to ask if Jonas had come through. Whitaker himself was on the trail with 2 of his men. They told the teamster the boy had been seen riding north Miss Holloway, north off the South Fork. They said the boy had taken the cutoff toward Eagle Saddle. They said they were going up to look for him. They told the teamster to ride on down to town and bring word. Tessa felt the cold come up her back inside the warm cabin. Eagle Saddle is not the way to town. Eagle Saddle is the way to nothing. Eagle Saddle in this storm is a place a man does not come out of. The teamster did not believe a word of it. He turned around and came back up to tell us. We rode out an hour ago in the worst of it. Tate took a fall a half-mile back. I got him this far. The storm is laying us under, Miss Holloway. We cannot go on. I have come to ask you. I have come to ask because there is no one else. He looked at her. You and that donkey know this country. Whitaker's men gave up before they ever started. They were not looking. I know they were not looking. They sent that boy up Eagle Saddle on purpose. I do not know why. I do not know what they have against us or against him. But the boy is up there. He is alive or he is dead. And if he is alive, he will not be alive much longer. And Tate cannot move. And I will not leave him. You are the last one we have. Tessa Holloway stood very still by the hearth. She thought of the deed she did not have. She thought of the 31 days that had become 21 days because she had not been counting tightly enough through the autumn work, and the run down to Baker City to file her contest would take 3 days, hard going each way, and the storm would lay the South Trail under for a week. And even if she rode out at first light tomorrow, she would be cutting it close, and if she rode out the day after, she would lose it altogether. She thought of the boy, Jonas Beckett, 17 years old, the nephew of 2 men who had trusted her with their winter's ore and their summer's dust for 3 months now. She had ridden into the Beckett diggings a half-dozen times. She had eaten supper at their table. She had let the boy show her a stone he had picked up out of the creek, a piece of pale rose-colored quartz he had been keeping in his coat pocket as a luck piece. He had grinned at her and put it back in his pocket. She thought of her father. She thought of Ambrose Kettering. She thought of broken and worthless. She said, I will go. Wyatt closed his eyes. She saw the relief go through him like a long breath he had been holding for hours. God bless you. God can bless me on the trail, she said. Help me get him to the bed. I need both my hands. They moved Tate Beckett to the rope frame bed and piled the blankets on him, and Tessa put the kettle close enough to be reached, but not close enough to be tipped, and she gave Wyatt the bone-handled knife old Burroughs had pressed on her at his doorway in case any visitor came through that door who should not. Keep this near him. I will be back as soon as the country lets me. You stay with your brother. Whatever happens, you stay. Yes, ma'am. She moved fast. She layered herself in everything warm she owned. Her father's old wool shirt, 2 pairs of socks inside her boots, a scarf wrapped twice around her face, the heavy oilcloth coat old Burrows had given her in lieu of a pelt fee in August. Her gloves, a second pair of gloves over those. She loaded Obed in the lean-to by lantern light. A small canvas of dried meat. A flask of hot broth she boiled fast over the fire and stoppered tight. 2 heavy wool blankets. A length of stout rope. A second lantern. A flint and steel. Her father's hammer in the saddle scabbard, because there might be ice on the upper trail to break through. She unwound the canvas windbreak from the front of the lean-to. "Old man," she said quietly to the donkey. His warm breath ghosted white in the lantern light. "I have asked you to do a hard thing tonight. I am sorry. We have to go up. We have to find a boy. You know Eagle Saddle. You know it better than any creature alive. Find him." She put her forehead against his neck. One long moment. Then she led him out into the storm. The wind hit her like an open hand. The world beyond the cabin yard was gone. The trail was gone. The trees were gone. There was only the white roar of the wind and the white blur of the snow and the soft, warm bulk of Obed beside her. And she put her left hand on his pack saddle and gripped tight, and she let him choose the line. He chose it. He did not hesitate at the gate. He turned north into the wind, into the country that ran up toward Eagle Saddle, and he walked at a steady, patient pace that he never quickened and never slowed. Tessa followed at his shoulder, leaning into the storm, her face going numb inside the scarf. Her eyes squinted to slits behind which the world reduced itself to the dark gray of Obed's hide, a foot from her cheek. 10 minutes, 20, an hour. She lost time. She lost direction. She could not tell up from down at the bad places where the trail crossed open scree under the snow. And twice she would have gone off the edge of country. She could not see if Obed had not stopped flat and refused to step. Once he turned them aside without explanation and walked them 60 yards off, what she would have sworn was the trail. And a minute later, she felt under her boot the bare scrape of stone where the snow had blown thin across a ledge. And she realized that the path she would have taken had been a drift over a drop, and the donkey had known. She talked to him as they walked. She did not know if he could hear her over the wind. She did not know if it mattered. She talked because the talking kept her warm inside her chest, where the cold had begun to find her. "He took a bear for you," she told him. "Your master, I mean. He wrote it down in his book so that no one would forget. And you took a bear for him. And now you are taking a storm for a boy you do not know, because I asked you to. Old man, you are the best partner I have ever had. Better than my hands, better than my hammer, better than anything I have ever owned in this world. The wind ate her words. The donkey walked on. 2 hours into the storm, deep into a country she did not know, with the white world howling around her and the cold beginning to creep up under her coat in a way she did not like. Obed stopped. He stood very still. His ears swung forward and back. He took a step to the right. He stopped again. He brayed once short and sharp. Then he walked off the trail. Tessa hesitated only one breath before she followed. They went down a short scree slope through the white, the donkey picking his way careful, and they came under the lip of a small overhanging rock where the wind suddenly cut off and the world fell into a strange, muffled quiet. A small bay against the cliff face, sheltered from the north wind, out of the worst of the snow, and in the bay against the rock, half buried in a drift that had blown up against him as he sat, was a boy. Jonas Beckett. He was not moving. She fell to her knees beside him and pulled the scarf off her face. She put her bare hand against his cheek. The cheek was cold. The cheek was very cold. But under the cold, she felt the slow, warm pulse of him, the small, stubborn flicker that meant a young animal had not given up yet. Jonas, Jonas, son, open your eyes. The eyelids moved. He did not open them. He only moved them, but he moved them, and that was enough. She worked fast. She wrapped him in both wool blankets. She got the stopper out of the broth flask with her teeth because her gloved hands would not work the cork. She dribbled the warm broth between his lips a little at a time. She watched his throat for the swallow. She saw the swallow. She gave him another sip. She gave him another. She held his cold face against her own warm one inside the wool of her coat collar, and felt him begin slowly to come back from whatever country he had been walking toward. His eyes opened a little. He looked at her. Miss Holloway. I have got you, son. I have got you. I am taking you home. He sent me wrong. Whitaker's men. They told me. They told me the South Fork was washed out. They said to take Eagle Saddle. I knew it was not. I knew. But they said the South Fork. They said, hush. You can tell it in the cabin. Save your breath. She got him onto Obed. It was the hardest thing she had ever done with her hands. He was a boy of 17, lean and long, but a boy of 17 who could not stand on his own feet, was a dead weight, and the storm was eating their margin minute by minute. She heaved. She braced him across her shoulder. She used the donkey's patient bulk
to lever him up onto the back saddle, and Obed knelt low without being asked, which she had never seen him do before, and she got the boy across the saddle, and she lashed him there with the length of stout rope, his chest down across the donkey's back, his arms hanging slack on either side.
She wrapped the blankets around him on the saddle. She took up the lead. "Take us home, old man. Take us home." Obed turned and started back the way they had come. They had gone perhaps 300 yards when she heard the voices. Voices in the storm. Men's voices. Calling. The kind of calling that was not searching, but was performing the appearance of searching, with a sharp edge of irritation under it that came from men out in weather they had not bargained for. A lantern bobbed in the white ahead. She stopped Obed. The lantern came on. Two shapes resolved themselves out of the snow. Two men on foot, leading horses behind them, the horses' heads low and miserable. The first man was Cole Renner. The second man, taller, in a long dark coat, caked with snow at the shoulders and the brim of his black hat, was Vance Whitaker. They saw her. They saw the boy across the donkey's back. They stopped. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved between them. The lantern bobbed and made strange shadows. Then Whitaker stepped forward. "Miss Holloway, you have found the boy." She did not answer. "That is well," he said. "We have been hunting him these 4 hours. We came up here when his uncles failed to report him in town. A terrible business. A boy his age lost in such a storm. You are to be commended for finding him. We will take him in from here. You have done your part. Hand him over, and we will see him safely to Crales." "I will see him safely to Crales myself." Whitaker's mouth went thin behind the snow on his beard. "Miss Holloway, you are tired. The boy is half dead. You are not in a fit condition to carry him out. I am offering my men. I am offering my horses. I am offering the help that is needed. You will give him over to me." "No." The wind moved. Cole Renner's hand drifted toward the coat where Tessa had no doubt a pistol lay against his ribs. Whitaker saw it. He raised one hand without looking. "Hold." He looked at Tessa a long moment. Then he stepped forward 2 paces slow, the way a man approaches a horse that might bolt. He came up close enough that she could see his eyes inside the snow on his lashes. His voice dropped low. "Miss Holloway, let us be honest with each other, you and I, in a way. The storm gives us leave to be honest. I sent that boy up Eagle's Saddle. My man told him the South Fork was washed out, and I instructed my man to do so. I knew what I was doing. I did not expect him to be found. I expected to come up tomorrow with my outfit and discover his body, and I expected the news of it to spread through the high country, with my name on the lips of every man as the man who had searched for the lost boy and come too late. I expected the Beckett brothers to weep at my feet for the loss And I expected Mercer Crail and every man who has been giving you his trade to remember that it was Vance Whitaker who searched, and that the girl who calls herself a packer was nowhere to be seen, and I expected to walk into your cabin a week later with the marshal at my side and put you off my ground. And not a soul in this country would have raised a hand for you, because you would have been the girl who let a boy die in a storm her donkey could have walked him out of. He paused. The snow fell between them. That was the plan, Miss Holloway. I am telling you so that you will understand the position you are in. You have ruined the plan. You have the boy alive across that donkey's back. If you ride down to Mercer Crail's with him, the story will not be the story I meant to write. The story will be the story you write, and it will end me. You understand. So you will hand him over. You will hand him over now, and you will turn around and ride back to your cabin, and we will see him into Crail's. He will live. The story will be a story of my outfit's hard work in a terrible storm. You will hold your peace, because if you do not hold your peace, I will see to it that the cache fire is the smallest thing that ever happens to you. Do you understand me, girl? Do I have to say it any plainer? You have said it plain enough. Then hand him over. No. The word was small in the wind. It carried. Vance Whitaker's hand moved inside his coat. He took one more step forward. He set his boot wrong. She would think about it the rest of her life, what made him set his boot wrong in that moment. Whether it was the storm, or the dark, or the rage, or whether some old hand of a kind power put a stone under his heel that should not have been there. He set his boot wrong, and the snow gave under it, and what was under the snow was not ground at all, but the lip of a drift that had blown out over a small crevice in the rock no wider than a man's body. His weight came down on the empty air below the drift. He pitched forward. He pitched sideways. He went down hard onto the stone with one leg folded under him at the wrong angle, and the sound of the leg breaking was small and dry and clean, even through the wind, like a green branch snapped across a knee. The cry he made was not small. It was not clean. It was the cry of a man whose body has shown him a betrayal he had not believed possible. Cole Renner stood frozen in the lantern light. He looked at his master on the ground. He looked at Tessa. He looked at the gun he had been about to draw. And Cole Renner, who was not a brave man and had never pretended to be one, turned and walked away into the storm, leading his horse without a word, and went down the trail toward the freight outfit and did not look back. She would learn later that he kept walking past the freight outfit. He kept walking past Glenrock Junction. He left the country. He was never seen in eastern Oregon again. Whitaker lay in the snow. His face was gray. His breath came in shallow gasps. The leg lay at the angle a leg should not lie at. He looked up at her, and his eyes in the lantern light were eyes she had not seen in his face before. The eyes of a man who has come to the end of the road he chose and has not yet finished being surprised by it.
She stood looking down at him. The storm moved around them. She thought of the cache fire.
She thought of the man's hand that had been on his coat, reaching for what she now believed had been a pistol meant for her. She thought of how easy it would be to take Obed and the boy and walk away, and how the country itself would finish what she chose not to finish, and how no court anywhere would ever know what had happened on a mountain in a storm in the dark. She thought of her father. She drew a long, slow breath. "Damn you," she said quietly. Not to him, to the country, to the part of herself she did not get to be tonight. She knelt down. She unwrapped one of the wool blankets from the boy and tucked it under Whitaker. She straightened the broken leg as gently as she could, and he cried out once and then bit it back. She lashed the leg with the length of stout rope she had brought, and a straight piece of pine she broke off a small dead branch nearby, and she made him a splint that would hold him together at least as far as the cabin. She got him up across her own shoulders. Not on Obed. The boy was on Obed. The man could ride the woman this night because the woman had legs that worked. She walked. She walked half a mile through the storm with a grown man across her shoulders and a half-dead boy lashed to her donkey, and her thighs burned, and her back screamed, and her breath came in small white gusts. And Obed walked at her side and pressed against her on the bad places where the wind tried to push her down. And they came at last in the dim gray edge of the early dawn into the cabin yard. Wyatt Beckett was at the door before she came across the meadow. He saw the donkey with the boy across him. He came running. He saw the man across her shoulders, and his face went hard and confused at once, and she said only, "Take Jonas. Get him to the fire. The man is Whitaker. He has a broken leg. Put him on the floor by the hearth. He will live. Do not kill him. Do you hear me, Wyatt? Do not kill him. I will tell you why later. Just do not." Wyatt looked at her a long moment. He nodded once. He took the boy. The cabin filled with warmth and motion and the smell of broth on the hook. And after a long time, when the boy was breathing easy and the man on the floor by the hearth had been splinted properly and dosed with the small bottle of laudanum she had kept on the high shelf for emergencies, and the storm had thinned to a soft, falling snow outside the window, Tessa Holloway sat down at her small table with her hands shaking and let herself feel for one short minute how close she had come to being a woman who let a man die. Then she set her hands flat on the wood and stopped shaking. 2 days later, when the weather broke and the trail opened, Wyatt Beckett rode down to Glen Rock Junction with Tessa's letter folded in his coat pocket. He brought back Mercer Crail and the deputy sheriff out of Baker City, and the widow Eulalie Sparrow in a wagon driven by the boy from the livery, and the 4 of them sat in the cabin with Vance Whitaker on the pallet by the hearth, and Vance Whitaker with his leg splinted and the fight gone out of him in a way that surprised even him, told the deputy everything. The fire at the cache shed, the order to Cole Renner to set it, the diversion of the boy up Eagle Saddle, the instruction to his men to delay the search and to be seen searching, but to find nothing. The whole long thread of it told quiet and flat, as a man tells a thing he has lived inside so long that the telling of it comes almost as a relief.
The deputy wrote it all down. Whitaker signed it. Mercer Crail signed as witness. Eulalie Sparrow signed as second witness, and at the bottom of the page in her old upright hand, she wrote one sentence of her own beneath her signature, which Tessa read later and did not forget. The wheel has come round. The boy lived. Jonas Beckett came back into himself slowly across 3 days by the cabin fire, and on the 4th day he asked for breakfast, and on the 5th day he walked to the door on his own legs, and on the 6th day Wyatt took him down the mountain to the diggings where Tate was waiting, and the 2 brothers had each other again, and the boy was returned to them whole. He gave Tessa, before he left the cabin, the rose-colored stone he had been carrying as a luck piece in his coat pocket. He pressed it into her palm with both his hands. He did not speak. He did not need to. She kept it on the table beside the journal. The night after they had taken Whitaker down the mountain in the wagon for the long ride to Baker City and the trial that would come in the spring, Tessa sat alone in the cabin by the fire with the pack saddle of Ambrose Kettering across her knees and a small knife in her hand. She had been thinking about it for 2 days. She had been turning it over in her mind since the conversation in the kitchen at the boarding house, since the widow had laid out the shape of the long kindness her father had set in motion in the South Valleys. She had been thinking of how a careful man who knew he was dying would leave the most important thing he had to leave, where he would put it, who he would trust with it. Ambrose Kettering had trusted the donkey with his life more than once. She picked at a loose stitch on the underside of the pack saddle's lining where the leather had been cleverly hand-sewn in a way that did not match the rest of the saddle's construction. She worked the stitches loose with the small knife. A folded oilcloth packet came out into her lap. She unfolded it by the firelight. Inside the oilcloth, dry and clean, and as fresh as the day it had been put there, lay a single sheet of heavy paper, a homestead patent, filed at the county seat in Baker City on the 14th day of August in the year 1875, in the name of Ambrose Kettering, free and clear for 160 acres of mountain ground, including all improvements thereon, signed by the federal land officer and stamped with the seal of the United States of America. Folded inside the patent in Ambrose Kettering's careful hand was a second sheet. A will. It was short. A man who has made his peace with his end does not need many words. Being of sound mind, I, Ambrose Kettering, do hereby bequeath all that is mine on this earth, namely the cabin and lands described in the patent enclosed herein, and the tools and goods within the cabin, and my donkey Obed, should he yet live to the next person of true heart, who shall ride this saddle to my door. If that person be a Holloway of the South Valleys, let them know that the wheel has come round, and that I have rested at last. If that person be another, let them know that broken and worthless are not the same word, and let them carry the saying forward as I have tried to. It was dated the 3rd of November, 1885, 4 months before he had died. 4 months before he had set the old donkey loose down the mountain to find whoever was meant to find him. He had known. He had known the whole time. Tessa Holloway sat by the fire with the paper in her hand for a long time. She did not weep. The weeping for what Ambrose Kettering had done for her had been done already in the widow's kitchen in the snow with the boy across the donkey's back in the silent meadow when she had come back from the storm. The paper now in her hand was only the last small confirmation. The wheel had come round. She rode down to Baker City the following week. She filed the patent and the will at the courthouse. The county clerk, a thin man with spectacles, read both documents twice and looked at her over the rims of his glasses and said in the dry, careful voice of a man who has seen a great deal of human nonsense, that everything was in order and that the claim filed against the ground by one Vance Whitaker the previous August was hereby and forever void. He stamped the patent. He gave her a copy. She rode home. 2 winters passed. The cabin held. The chimney drew. The lean-to stood. The high passes filled in November and opened again in May, and the work of the packer went on through the years as it had gone on for Ambrose Kettering. Before her, with the silver dollars accumulating slow in the tin under the loose floorboard, and the silver hair beginning to come in at the temples of Tessa Holloway, who had not yet turned 27, and looked some days like she had lived a long, full life already. Obed grew old. He grew older. He limped a little more on the bad leg in the cold weather. He grayed white around the muzzle. He still walked the trails. He still picked his way through the bad places. He still pressed her against the inside wall on the narrow ledges, although he did it slower now and rested longer at the switchbacks, and let her load him lighter than he had once carried. She did not ride him in the worst weather anymore. She did not need to. She had bought a second donkey, a brown young jenny she called Ruth, out of the same book her mother had read to her, and Ruth carried the heavy loads, and Obed walked at the head of the string as the lead animal because the trail was his still, and would be his till the end. In the second autumn, on a clear, bright morning in October, when the aspens were turning gold along the high creeks,
An old miner from over on Cedar Ridge brought up to her cabin a young donkey colt he had no use for. The colt's mother had died. The colt was sickly. The colt was likely to die. The old miner had heard he said that Miss Holloway was a woman who knew what to do with an animal nobody else wanted. Tessa took the colt. She nursed him through a hard winter on warm gruel and patience. She named him Caleb after her father, and she watched him grow strong by spring. And she watched Obed take to the small new creature with the patient tolerance of an old grandfather watching a child climb on his lap. She wrote the night the colt first walked steady across the meadow on his own 4 legs in the first pages of a new leather-bound journal she had bought in Baker City the previous summer and had not yet begun to fill. I owe a debt to an old donkey nobody wanted, and to 2 men I never met in full. The one was my father, and the other was a man my father saved without ever knowing what would come of it. The wheel has come round to me, and I mean to send it round again. To this colt. To any creature 2-legged or 4 that the world has thrown away too quick. Broken and worthless are not the same word. I will carry the saying forward as long as I am able. She closed the journal. She set it on the shelf beside the journal of Ambrose Kettering, the leather of the 2 books touching where they stood. Outside in the soft light of evening, Obed stood in the meadow with the new colt at his shoulder, and the country lay quiet under a sky going slow to indigo, and the high blue ridges rose up clean against the last of the light, and the wind moved through the pines. She had spent her last dollar on an animal nobody wanted. It had been the best dollar she ever spent.